Happy penultimate last day, or penultimate day, I guess it would be, of February 2025. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. I am Eric Balkman from the FFPC, the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, and the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown. Joined tonight by the guy you know from the Stealing Bananas podcast with Ben Gretsch. You know him from RotoViz Overtime with Colin Kelly. You know him from RotoViz. He is the FF Contrarian at FF _Contrarian on the X. Shawn Siegele, welcome aboard, man. Thanks for hanging out tonight.
Yeah, I'm excited. We've done this a couple times, and those 2 hours fly by.
They do. They usually do. And honestly, what I like about your shows that you do is you and Ben, especially you and Ben, I think it's very stream of conscious. Like you'll get onto something, and then I almost feel like I'm falling down like a wormhole in one of your brains, like, you know, whether it's you or Ben making a point, and I can kind of, you know, pick up on everything like that. And whether it's, you know, talking dynasty strategy or talking about late round running back attack, stuff like that. I always learn something. So keep up the great work. We'll definitely be promoting that throughout the show tonight. I also want to promote a few things that the FFPC is doing right now. The Never Too Early Best Ball and Superflex Best Ball tournaments are going on at myffpc.com. The Never Too Early tournament, a $125 entry fee, could get you a $40,000 grand prize, $35 to get in the Superflex version, and a $10,000 grand prize in that. Those tournaments are already off and running. They will cease on April 24th, which is the first day of the NFL draft. You can draft now with a 30-second, 60-second, 2-hour or 6-hour clock. And while you're there, you can pick up a Dynasty Orphan team today. Entry fees range from $77 all the way up to all the way up to $5,000. A lot of teams have already been discounted for 2025. We've had, I think, coming up on, once the startup seasons begin, we'll have 1,900 Dynasty leagues. None have ever folded in a decade and a half. So, you know, once you join a Dynasty league with the FFPC, you are in good hands. That's also at myffpc.com. And the thing we're most proud of this year, the FFPC Big Gorilla Tournament, $1 million grand prize, $350 entry fee. You can get a 3-pack for $1,000. Drafts are already off and running now, both slow and live. The Early Rampage and the 7 Bananas promos are live too. And the Early Rampage promo is pretty cool. You're basically getting into 2 tournaments for one. The Early Rampage is going to be made up of the first 200 leagues formed with the Big Gorilla Tournament this year. And if you are able to win that, you'll not only win the $10,000 grand prize, you're still eligible for the $1 million grand prize and all the other prizes in the actual Big Gorilla Tournament. And then the 7 Bananas promo is live as well. If you get that 7 pick twice in a row, you're going to get a free FFPC Best Ball entry. If you get it 3 times in a row, free main event entry. 4 times in a row, we'll get you a free $10,000 High Society entry. And if you get the 7 pick in the Big Gorilla 5 times in a row, you will win a 4-person jungle safari, or $50,000, whatever you want to do. That's the 7 Bananas promo. You know, the thing is, we're talking with the commissioner of the banana stand here tonight, with apologies to the Blues. But Shawn, we got to figure out something that we could do marketing wise with the 7 Bananas promo, and then obviously the Stealing Bananas, Money in the Banana Stand. There's got to be something there, right?
Well, the whole time you were describing that, I was thinking, I love anything with bananas in the title. I mean, these are fantastic contests. Fantastic promotions you've got running. I love those Superflex Best Ball tournaments. And then, I mean, the Dynasty leagues, those orphans, we had some people reach out to us this offseason saying that they did a lot of orphans. It seems like it's something that is going to take you a long time to turn it around. And sometimes that's the case, right? That's not impossible. One of the things, there are some pretty good teams that have been orphaned. The other side of that, even the ones you have to work a little bit more on, when we had teams, we had a lot of people reach out, say they had won them right off the bat, made a ton of money from it. Dynasty, I mean, every part of fantasy football is awesome. But, I mean, don't forget about Dynasty. It's probably the most fun experience you can have playing.
You play 365 days a year. I think it's fantastic. One of the things, and I haven't brought this up as much this year, but I think one of the misconceptions about a lot of these Dynasty teams, sometimes life gets in the way. We have people playing these, you know, guys in their early 20s, guys in their early 70s, right? Stuff happens. They want to hang it up. They don't want to play anymore. They just get married, or they start a family or a new job, and they don't have time to manage these teams. And some of these get orphaned and they're really, really good. And you definitely should be taking advantage of that. My FFPC.
Well, Colin and I did a full series on an org team that we took over 2 years ago, and like how you would fix them. The problem was the one that we had grabbed was actually really good. So that was mostly just, let's keep this going.
And that happens sometimes. I was in a private Dynasty league. It's made up of some of my friends and then some FFPC players that we play outside of the FFPC. And I joined it in 2023 was the first year. And I did okay. I mean, it was all right. But I didn't trade any of the I probably should have traded some of the aging pieces, and maybe it'll cost me now. But I didn't trade away Kyron Williams. I didn't trade away Saquon Barkley. Drake London had a big year. Jackson Smith and Jigba had a big year. And then, much to my surprise, I won the league this past year. So even though the team may not look all that great, it can look somewhat similar. But things change in the NFL so fast, you could actually take that team to victory and win a championship right away or in year two for sure. Cullen Hoffman already chiming in. A guy, speaking of FFPC success stories, Cullen Hoffman, who's won, I don't know, darn near $300,000 over the last 2 years in the FFPC. Great to see Shawn, the sharpest guy in fantasy football. And listen, you are right up there, my friend, for sure. Let's get into it tonight as we start off. And I promise you, we're going to go around the NFL first. We will get to the rookies. This will be a rookie-heavy show, but we're going to start off with some veteran news first. And I wanted to start off in San Francisco, Shawn. John Lynch, the GM of the Niners, said that they're going to try to honor Deebo Samuel's request to be traded out of San Francisco. If they do trade Samuel, they're going to eat $32 million in dead cap. That's going to reduce their cap space by $15 million. So if they are going to make a deal, the team that's picking up Samuel is probably going to have to compensate them very well. Samuel apparently wants to move on, and maybe this is a situation where it's change of scenery will do the trick, but it was a bad year. 806 yards from scrimmage. That was the second lowest of his career. I don't know how you are handling him in best ball drafts right now, Shawn, but in the FFPC Big Gorilla, which granted is a managed format, he's wide receiver 40 at the 806 right now. This is Calvin Ridley, Jacoby Myers territory. Does that represent a value to you, knowing that Samuel's not a young man anymore, at least as far as wide receiver age goes, and we don't know where he's going to end up for 2025?
Yeah, it could be. And yet you look at where Samuel was last year, and with the injuries, I mean, that should have been a great situation for him. When you work back through the numbers over the last 4 or 5 years for Samuel, what you're seeing there is someone who is not particularly good at catching the ball. That often doesn't matter, right? If you're a target hog, or if you were like Samuel, who's otherworldly after the catch, no one can really match him. But you need to have one of those two components, and the extremely high evasion rate in 2024 fell. The ability to draw a lot of targets fell. And so you have the situation 2021, 2023, he's a wide receiver 2 or better 55% of the time. That collapsed to just 33% last year. And he started stacking all of the negative traits that he brings to the table. Didn't draw the targets. I talked about that, inability to catch the ball. Guys with 75 plus targets, he was 48th out of 54 guys in on target catch percentage. Again, that's kind of baked in, but you have to be able to do the other things. As he gets to 29 here, those aren't necessarily the ones that I like to chase. Blair has done a lot of great research on guys who collapse, and then where does the bounce back come from? Should you count on the bounce back? This isn't the type of profile with an older, inefficient player that you necessarily want to chase that. I do think he'll probably outscore a number of the players that you mentioned in that range, and yet I think there at the same time are going to be picks that you want to prioritize and set.
I just the fountain of youth, to your point, to what Blair Andrews, your colleague over at RotoViz, is saying, like this doesn't often happen where a guy at this age all of a sudden re-gets it. And I understand the value of him right now. Never too early FFPC a best ball tournament ADP for Deebo Samuel right now wide receiver 44 in the 8th round. Okay, I get that there's a discount there, but how much are you really, how much are you really profiting by taking advantage of him there? You're still soaking an 8th round pick into him, which is my concern. I don't think, as I always say, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze at that point. Joe King, pointing out he's got running back wear right now, which, kind of is true. Let's move on and talk about the Saints here. Mickey Loomis, the GM for New Orleans, has said that they believe that they can win with Derek Carr. Nick Underhill, who writes for New Orleans.football, said that Kellen Moore stated that the Saints feel fortunate to have Derek Carr. And by the way, the Saints, who are always seemingly in cap hell, if they release him, that's another $21 million in dead cap money. He has a no trade clause in his contract. And it seems like Carr is going to be on the team this coming year. Quarterback 30 in the never too early Superflex best ball tournament right now, as he is going off at the 11:06, kind of like by himself a little bit, well after Shadir Sanders and Justin Fields, and then a little bit before Russell Wilson and Kirk Cousins. I look at the Saints situation as probably not a great one at the moment, Shawn. But we saw Alvin Kamara have a nice little late career 2024 season. I know Chris Olave has been dealing with the concussions, but he could come back healthy this year. They will undoubtedly be hitting up the wide receiver position in this year's draft as well. So I look at Derek Carr as quarterback 30 right now as a nice little value. The problem is he's got to stay on the field. How do you think the Saints offense is as a whole right now? To be honest, I've been avoiding most players on the Saints offense right now, but the linchpin is kind of Carr. He's got to stay healthy. And if he doesn't, then Rattler comes in and becomes a little bit more problematic.
Yeah, so much of it's going to come down to health and coaching. Carr is one of these guys where I probably have always been a little bit too high on him because some of the metrics actually come out looking somewhat positive. He's one of the two guys that Ben and I do have on our RotoViz Triflex Dynasty team. And, that was one of the things that held us back in the playoffs this year. But you look at the numbers, and we do a lot of stuff with Sports Info Solutions. They've got a fantastic amount of overall content, lots of great charting. They do things with IQR, which is their adjusted quarterback rating that removes elements that the QB, can't handle after the ball is in the air. They have a points above average per play stat that really is a transformed EPA number that again includes charting. When you look at Carr from last season, 10th in IQR, second in points above average per play. Now we know that he hit on some deep passes. Some of those things probably aren't that replicable or could be attributed to the receiver, but it's not just a season where he played in a handful of games. You look back to the previous year, he's among the top passers, and again, points above average per attempt and WAR. You go back to his Raiders days and his last 2 full seasons with Gruden, 2019, 2020, top 10 in IQR and points above average in both of those years. So you're starting to look at a lot of different seasons where the numbers for Carr actually look really good. So then the question is, can he be someone like a Baker Mayfield who, with the right coaching environment, suddenly becomes fantasy relevant? Or is that somewhat unlikely, which it does seem somewhat unlikely, and certainly it's priced that way. Can he play well enough to support the other pieces? I think if the coaching piece is there and he stays healthy, then he probably can. That's what the numbers suggest. He's one of these guys who probably is better than perception, whereas some of the other people who get a lot more coverage probably worse.
Yeah. And I think that it's something to keep in. I mean, listen, you know what you're doing with the Saints this year. You're taking a risk, but you're also getting at a discount, and what's going to happen with we don't know what's going to happen with Derek Carr, but the risks. And when you're going into that for sure. A quarterback that we are pretty much convinced that is going to be New Orleans is Carr. We know who he's going to be on. We don't know where Aaron Rodgers is going to go, if anywhere, Shawn. The New York Daily News, Pat Leonard, has reported that Rodgers prefers to play with the Rams and apparently, of course, will bring Davante Adams along with him. This is something that worked out great in Green Bay. I would say there's a narrative out there that's saying that it was a massive bomb in New York. I don't think it was that. I think that these guys strung together some pretty good performances when it comes to those two. The thing that I think is interesting here Aaron Rodgers could end up throwing to the likes of Davante Adams and Puka Nacua, or he could be retired. Davante Adams could be the number 1 wide receiver on a team, or he could be the number 2 for the Rams this year next to the aforementioned Nacua. When you look at where these guys are going in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament in the FFPC right now, Rodgers is not being drafted even as a top 32 guy. He's quarterback 34 in the 18th round. Davante Adams right now in the Never Too Early tournament, wide receiver 21 at the 411. It's weird to say this. I'm actually okay with the Rodgers value, but what about Davante Adams being drafted as a wide receiver 2 inside the top 25? Again, not knowing where he's going to end up and knowing that, you know, the range of outcomes for what he could have this season is fairly wide, and people are soaking a 4th round pick into that.
Yeah, I mean, he's done some really impressive things, not just obviously over the course of his career, but even recently. You think a little bit about DeAndre Hopkins and where he was, and those two guys really being, you know, the receivers for a decade. And then there was always this sense that when the Chiefs needed Hopkins, that they were saving him, he would do something. And you watch in the Super Bowl, I mean, he could barely run down the field. He could barely put his arms up. We're not there with Davante Adams, but you have those risks for old receivers, especially when you don't know where they're going to be. I don't even know that being with Aaron Rodgers is that great. I mean, you're getting a guy who last year was number 28 in boom rate, right? You're talking about 2022 numbers. And obviously, you have the injury wiping out 2023, but the 22 numbers were also bad. His last 35 games, he's got 8 QB1 finishes. Some of this is filtered through my enthusiasm for Garrett Wilson and the frustration that when you look at his numbers and you look at his adjusted yards per attempt when targeted, right? They were higher with Mike White. They were higher with Joe Flacco. They were just barely lower with Zach Wilson. Now, I mean, obviously, all of that has plenty of narratives attached to it as well. I guess that if I'm the Rams, I probably want this next guy as our quarterback instead.
You would prefer Rodgers as the
next
quarterback?
The next name up here is Matthew Stafford.
Okay, yeah.
And I mean, he hasn't been awesome either, but
well, here's the thing. We know he's been skiing with Tom Brady in Montana, apparently. Whether that was planned or not, I don't want to get into that because Ian Rappaport and Jordan Schultz are handling all the heat for that at the moment. Connor Hughes has reported that he believes Matthew Stafford isn't leaving Los Angeles, that he is staying firmly with the Rams next season. Connor Hughes covers the Giants. And why is he reporting on Stafford? Well, Giants have been linked to Stafford, and the Giants have been. They would probably be very excited to get a quarterback of Matthew Stafford's ilk on the team to throw to Malik Neighbors next season for sure. The reason Hughes surmises that the Rams are allowing him to seek out a trade and talk to other teams is to find out what his market value is. And once that is determined, the Rams and the Stafford's people will agree to something that keeps him in the fold for Los Angeles this coming year. Now, in the FFPC Never Too Early Superflex Best Ball Tournament right now, I can tell you that Matthew Stafford currently is going off as quarterback number 27 at the 905. He is going ahead of beg your pardon. He is going behind Cam Ward, going behind Sam Darnold. He's going ahead of Shadur Sanders and Justin Fields. Your thoughts here, Shawn? Should we just assume that Stafford is back in Los Angeles? I know we don't like to assume stuff in the NFL, but at that point, quarterback 27, I could definitely get on board with that because he's going to have Nacua. He won't have Kupp, but he should have somebody else. And I'm very excited to see what Higbee can do with a full season next year too.
Yeah. Some of the teams that you've mentioned have really exciting young talent. So you're not going to have a Puka Nacua in all likelihood because he's so unique, but the teams that are being bandied about are really some of the few teams that have a player who might be similar. Do they have the coaching that would be similar? We know that Matthew Stafford's fit there has been absolutely fantastic. You look at his season last year, he didn't play well. He's outside the top 20 in those IQR and PA metrics that I mentioned earlier. One of the ones that really jumped out to me for him, number 30 in on-target percentage, which, that's not great, right? He still is going to be a guy who limits the sacks, limits the interceptions, and you put that with someone who historically has been able to generate these massive seasons. You think about Calvin Johnson, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. All of those things are exciting, I think, from a reality perspective, and they're certainly exciting for whoever the number one option is. But you think about even some of the other guys down the stretch of last season, it was Nacua, and there was nothing else in terms of what he was doing. I would be concerned that we really are entering the decline phase with Stafford, that there's injury risk, that you have, Matthew Stafford, you think back to the Lions days, and even at the NFL level, this is a very unique guy in terms of arm talent. And he was also someone where, because the Lions were so poorly put together, they would always try and cover that fact by blaming things on Matthew Stafford's decision-making, which, granted, you're going to mature as you work through this. You're going to get great coaching there when you go to the Rams. But the decision-making wasn't the problem. It was the Lions that were the problem. You've got a guy with immense arm talent, plays the quarterback position extremely well. Is the arm talent going to be there in the future? And if it's not, what are the downstream effects from that? I think that we have to start to be a little bit concerned.
Yeah, definitely concerned. Quarterback 27, okay, you're basically drafting him as your third quarterback. In fact, some people who already have two quarterbacks on the roster, maybe one with a top 6 or 7 quarterback, they're not even looking at Stafford in that tournament. So I get it. The risk is baked in, but I'm definitely planning on him being a Ram next year until I am told otherwise. Where would you rather see him go? Would you rather see him? Let's just compare these 3 locations. Stafford as a Ram, Stafford as a Giant, or Stafford as a Raider. For fantasy purposes, what's the best spot for him in your opinion?
Well, 2 of my very favorite players are Neighbors and Bowers. They were the 2 guys that we were, along with Jaden Daniels. Everybody was excited about those 3 guys. We had them even crazy high in comparison to the expectations. I really want to see what Neighbors and or Bowers could do with a real quarterback. I think you have the possibility of getting off the charts production in your, obviously you have record-breaking production in a variety of ways just as rookies. You're talking about seasons that, we could be telling people about 20 years from now if you get that viable QB. Having said that, again, I'm not 100% sure that Stafford is that guy.
Okay, interesting. I'll tell you a guy that I have, and you probably do too, have serious misgivings about at the quarterback position, and that's Anthony Richardson. Chris Ballard, who is the GM of the Colts, says there is going to be an open competition between Richardson and another quarterback that the team will bring in this offseason. Ballard thinks it's going to be good for Richardson, and just because there's a quarterback competition doesn't necessarily mean Richardson's not going to win it. He very well could. Ballard says the player has to be someone who could challenge from a production standpoint. I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know. The great thing about this is you're not paying a premium for any Colts receivers right now with Pittman, with Downs, Mitchell, or even Tyler Warren, who's being mocked to the Colts in so many mock drafts right now at the tight end position. So I guess the thing here is I'm not necessarily concerned what this Colts quarterback competition does for those receivers. What I am concerned about is knowing the ceiling for Anthony Richardson, how tempting that is, knowing he is going as quarterback 19 at the 5-6 turn in the Superflex, never too early Superflex tournament with the FFPC right now, Shawn. That is tempting, knowing that, he's going behind guys like Trevor Lawrence, Dak Prescott, Drake. Well, Drake May does have some legs. CJ Stroud, these guys that don't run, and Richardson does, and he throws such a great deep ball. He's just got to be able to hone in his accuracy on the intermediate pass. And I think he could be a very, not a great, but a very good quarterback this year. And that definitely a great fantasy quarterback. Or do I just have my Anthony Richardson colored goggles on right now, and it's just not going to come together for him this year? How are you handling him in drafts at the moment for best ball?
Yeah, that situation with Richardson always does come down to price and what it costs you. And in drafts it almost always costs you something. When he was benched and released in main events last year, I added him to the back of almost all of my rosters. And even though, I mean, one of the great things I think we did, and, you know, sometimes you get lucky and sometimes like we were right. We think it was based on the evidence, and we strongly recommended people avoid Richardson in rookie drafts a couple of years ago. That was one of the sort of foundation pieces from that year's draft guide. I mean, a rookie guide just debuted the other day. And the reason is that the profile was just so scary, right? People think about, okay, well, he's not a very good passer, and there are other guys who are not particularly good passers who can make it work because they attack vertically, which is something that Richardson has occasional success with, and they have this incredible athleticism. And so you mentioned the upside. I do think it's there. But when we think about what the Colts have had to do with their offense to make it work at all, it is a little bit troubling, right? And the rushing numbers, while very, very good, are not to the level still that we would hope, or that they would completely balance out what he's doing otherwise. Justin Fields, we were kind of talking about as the best case scenario for Richardson. And when you look at the EP numbers, the FPOE, so expected points, fantasy points over expected last year with Richardson as a runner on a per game perspective, they were good, but they were slightly below what Fields had given from 2022 through 2024 when he started. Again, that's good. It's not necessarily completely difference making. And then you look at what he is as a passer, and everybody knows his completion percentage was incredibly low. Some of that is because he attacked vertically so much, but he also was, and I think I was looking at 100 attempts. I think there were 46 QBs who qualified. He was 44th in positive percentage, which again means it's going to be very difficult to sustain drives. He was also dead last in catchable percentage and on-target percentage on throws of 5 yards or less. So when we think about how low his completion percentage was, it's not just because he's attacking deep and those are going to be harder balls to complete. He was also wildly inaccurate on the short throws. Those were elements that we knew coming in that showed up in college. Some folks who've done a lot of fantastic work for us on the college side in the past, and someone we just had on Overtime, Travis May, he really emphasized that a lot of the work that he has done on QBs has been very helpful for me in terms of working through some of these elements. You look at some of the guys coming through now, and some of the players like a Jalen Milroe, for example, who arguably gets painted with a little bit of the same brush. We'll get to some of these rookies later, but the numbers for Levis and the numbers for Richardson as college players were so poor that it really puts them in a completely different category. Again, it's not that you can't hit. QB projection is very difficult, but we are seeing the same problems that he had as a prospect really manifest in a way at the NFL level that just, it makes it tough, right? And you think about what a reality team is trying to do. You know, do they want to go through that again for another full season? I think that in some ways it gets to be unfair because a team, now we know that there are probably some maturity issues and probably some leadership issues. I think that the team has some incentive to throw those things out and act like, okay, it wasn't a bad pick. We didn't select a 3rd round player and then start him so much because we didn't know what we were doing. It's because he's not working at the stuff. You know, maybe it's a little bit of both, but you selected somebody that was really unlikely to hit, and now you don't want to take responsibility.
You know, the other thing too with Richardson's poor numbers in college, and I know I'm guilty of this. I kind of swept it under the rug because I was like, yeah, you know, it's such a small sample size. Didn't have a lot of experience. He didn't even really start a full season there. But at the same time, like now we get to the NFL and like the evidence was there. I just had to look at it and stare at it. And now, you know, he's fighting an uphill battle to be fantasy relevant in the NFL now. Let's talk about a guy who is definitely fantasy relevant. And quite frankly, it almost seems like we're doing a weekly update on Tee Higgins on this program in this first segment. And we're going to, Shawn, until they have either tagged him or extended him or announced that they're letting him go to free agency. Duke Tobin, who is the director of personnel for the Cincinnati Bengals, says he's optimistic about keeping Tee Higgins as a Bengal. And he says the desired outcome is a long-term extension. If they do tag him It doesn't mean he plays on the tag. It means that it will extend the time where the Bengals and Higgins team can negotiate. And then maybe they could rescind the tag because they've extended him. 30 million plus a season on an extension. I think the Bengals would be willing to pay. I think Higgins is probably going to want a little bit more than that, even though that 30 million would be obviously awesome. My whole stance on this, as far as drafting best ball teams right now, Shawn, is Higgins is either going to end up being in an elite situation with Cincinnati, a situation on an elite offense with Jamar Chase, with Chase Brown, with Joe Burrow, probably most importantly there, as the number 2 option in the passing game, or somebody is going to pay him to be their number 1 receiver, which should also mean a ton of targets. Maybe he won't be as efficient there, but that efficiency could be offset by volume. Higgins is being drafted as the wide receiver 14 in the middle of the 3rd round in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament right now. Are FFPC players handling Higgins the right way? Again, not knowing exactly where he's going to be playing football in 2025.
I think so. So much for me with the early picks, you really do have to be emphasizing the talent. So the question then is, who is Tee Higgins? Because we have had some issues at times where you have the health red flags. You're probably not going to get a great on-target catch rate. We know a couple of years ago, especially, it was really catastrophic where he's uncovered, passes are hitting him in the hands. He looks like he's trying to bat them away as a defender. And he's inconsistent in terms of that after the catch prowess. There's occasional dynamism, but it's not something where you're going to necessarily count on that either. But what you're getting is a big-bodied receiver who allows you to attack those intermediate depths. That's something that's key for an NFL offense. You pull up the pass location grid on our player page for him, you're going to see a sea of green at those locations, and you're going to see it across seasons. I think the Higgins choice for the Bengals is really interesting in light of, or just as it fits into this conversation that Ben and I had. You mentioned stealing bananas at the beginning. I really appreciate that. We go in with a plan, but the idea is to talk through and learn things from each other, and or just think about things that maybe we hadn't even thought about before the show started. We were talking about quarterbacks, and at times it morphed into this conversation of what do NFL teams need to do right now in order to compete with the super teams, and what do the super teams need to do to be able to defeat each other. Building this unstoppable juggernaut offense, to me, is just very clearly the key. And you have these elite mobile quarterbacks who are driving almost all of that. The way that you compete with them is to be the Detroit Lions. Now, we know the Lions had a playoff meltdown, but they have an absurd number of pieces around Jared Goff. The Bengals, I don't think you can be satisfied with a Jamar Chase. You've got to keep those pieces around him. You've got to go out there and say, we're going to score almost every possession. That's what the top teams have to do right now, and that's what you're going to have to do if you want to get by these teams in the AFC, as they did a handful of years ago.
I think Higgins is being drafted, I don't want to say at his ceiling right now, but I think he could easily return that and maybe a little bit higher, which is why I don't think he's be drafting at his ceiling. But there's a bit of a risk to it. And perhaps my biggest concern, Shawn, is what happens if the Bengals extend Hendrickson and then they bring in a couple of playmakers on defense, or just improvements, like marginal improvements. All of a sudden that Bengals defense isn't as bad, and Burrow's not having to throw the ball till his arm falls off. And we have fewer targets for Chase, fewer targets for Higgins, fewer targets for Chase Brown. And that offense obviously just is not getting an opportunity to run as many plays as they did last year. That's something real, although that might be something that, I'll see it when I believe it. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Well, and you
go ahead.
Run into this potential trap, right? Where I think the Kansas City Chiefs thought that was going to work, and it did work. You think of all the Super Bowls they've made since they made the Tyreek Hill move. They've been the best team of football from that point on, but they got caught up a little bit, arguably, and they tried to do some things. Their guys got hurt. Obviously, they wanted to be better on offense, but you get into that Super Bowl, even after you've emerged from the probably more dominant or more difficult AFC, and you realize, oh, just the defense won't do it. I would just like to see a team like the Bengals, even if the defense improves, and it's going to improve some, but even if it got to that point where, it's more in the range of what the Chiefs are doing, go out there and bury your opponents, right?
Yeah.
No one wants to see. I say this as someone who grew up in Kansas City, loves the Chiefs, was devastated by the Super Bowl, all those types of things, but it's not just the Super Bowl. No one wants to see you win games by 2 points if you are a team like the Chiefs, or certainly what the Bengals should be.
I want to move on and talk about, we've been talking about a lot of these players are being drafted towards the top. Let's talk about a sleeper, and that's Brenton Strange from Jacksonville. I bring this up because this is, and you tell me if this is a Sharky move or not, Shawn. James Gladstone, who is the new GM of the Jaguars, said that he thinks Strange is going to have a, quote, part in the offense moving forward in a way we haven't seen yet. It's kind of a cryptic quote, and this could mean a lot of things. It could mean the Jaguars are going to put Strange and Engram on the field more so this year than they have in years before with Liam Cohen as the head coach. It could mean that Evan Engram might be not on the team this coming year. Maybe he's going to be cut. Strange last year went from 32% snap share to 56%. From 2023 to 2024, 32 to 56. Now, obviously, some of these stats were inflated when Evan Engram was out, but 40 catches, 400 yards, and 2 touchdowns. We don't know if Christian Kirk is going to be on this team. We don't know if Evan Engram is going to be on this team. We do know it's going to be Brian Thomas, obviously. We'll get to him a little bit later on, or maybe we won't. I can't remember if I put that on the rundown. It's not important. But what do you make of Brenton Strange, a guy that people who watched this show last year on Thursday night would tell me in the chat, bulky, Brenton Strange this week when Evan Engram was out. Brenton Strange this week. Brenton Strange. Check him out. Brenton Strange. And now he's tight end 37. Now he's being drafted in the 19th round of the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament with the FFPC. This is a guy who you can see the path to him being a starting tight end for Jacksonville this year. A guy who's flashed. It looks like he's got some chops. And he's a 19th round pick. Now, you got to be bold here. You got to be willing to take a backup tight end there. But this could pay off big time, Shawn. What do you make of Brenton Strange in the 19th round right now as a deep sleeper?
I don't have a lot to add to that other than I would like to think the Jaguars are doing a little bit of a game here where they made it draw a name out of the hat. They're going to keep doing that. Weekly, he's going to have a new deep sleeper on the roster who's going to be a big part of whatever they're doing in a way that we haven't seen yet. My other note would be that he was trusted with more routes and delivered more total production than Theo Johnson or Tyler Warren at Penn State in both 2021 and 2022. Now, a little bit of that is based on the trajectory that those guys are on, but I mean, those are names where if you were ahead of them, and especially, ahead of Tyler Warren, even though Warren very controversial with the path that he did take, but it begins to be easier to understand where all three of those guys were from a production perspective as prospects when you think about the cannibalization that occurred.
Excuse me. I think when you look back at this quote from Gladstone in August or September, I mean, who's to say that Jacksonville, maybe they cut Engram and maybe they cut Kirk and then they invest in, Elijah Arroyo or Fannin Jr., somebody like that. And all of a sudden, okay, well, this quote means nothing. And that's why I never like to put a whole lot of stock into this, but I think it's interesting bringing it up because of what it could mean for Brenton Strange and the Jacksonville Jaguars offense in general this season. Dan Morgan, the former linebacker, I believe, Carolina Panthers Hall of Fame or Ring of Honor, whatever they do there, linebacker, who is now their GM, said that Xavier Legette underwent foot surgery this past season. Now, past offseason. I bring this up because there's a lot of people who love to talk about Jalen Coker. I've been talking about Adam Thielen a lot because I loved what he was able to do, admittedly with Coker as well, with Bryce Young down the stretch of last season. At this time last year, Shawn, we were talking about Xavier Legette, wondering where he was going to go, potential first-round pick. This guy could be really, really good. And then he kind of underwhelms, right? Now, he was an older prospect coming into the draft, and he definitely didn't set the world on fire. He flashed last year, but we have seen players make this leap from year one to year two. Your thoughts on Xavier Legette, now not only battling Jalen Coker and potentially Adam Thielen for targets in this offense, but battling, recovering from a foot surgery this offseason as well.
Well, perhaps that explains some of the different elements. Guys with 75 plus targets last year, the only two who were worse in terms of points above average per route were Elijah Moore and Dontavian Wicks. We know some of the reasons that they would have disappointed or underperformed. Legette was another one of those picks by the Panthers where it's a little bit more hope-based than trajectory, production, what have you, like true prospect grade based. And so that, with the poor rookie season, probably puts him on a path to irrelevance. But certainly you want to give him a chance. Now, I say that within the context of, Jalen Coker has been Blair's guy. He does simply look better in a wide variety of ways. And I think you've got to be skeptical of probably a lot of these different guys, but Coker is the name I'm probably more excited about.
Yeah, just looking at, I should look at the ADP for the Carolina Panthers receivers coming into the season. Right now in the Never Too Early tournament, you're looking at Thielen as wide receiver 65, Legette as wide receiver 66, and then Jalen Coker as wide receiver 70. So they're all bunched up in that early, anywhere from the early 15th to the early 16th. You can get them late, which is interesting given how Bryce Young came on at the end of last year, and that Coker is the cheapest, not by much, but he is the cheapest there. And certainly of those three, you tell me who passed the eye test last year, it was Coker out of those three, and it wasn't even close. Khalil Shakir is also going as wide receiver 41 right now in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament at the 806. Did he move up a little bit because of his contract? Potentially, because now he is under contract with the Bills through 2029. 821 yards, 4 touchdowns, 76 catches last year. Now he gets $32 million guaranteed with Buffalo. He was 1 touchdown short of leading the team in touchdown receptions as well. Does this extension mean to you, Shawn, that the Bills are comfy going with Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, maybe Matt Collins, I don't know, but Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, and Dalton Kincaid as their main pass catching weapons? I think Shakir was an interesting guy. Like, I didn't know what to believe about him in drafts this year. And I feel like this kind of cements him as a higher floor, low ceiling type guy that you can add on. That's going to be doing yeoman's work for you throughout the season. At least the Bills believe in him. Should we believe in him as well?
This is the type of play that I think you probably layer in occasionally. It is the type of play where you probably get the small win. In virtually every circumstance, when I am going to come to this pick, I'm going to have multiple players I like better. Again, you mentioned the floor. You love it for his floor. Josh Allen is so unique. I don't know that he's going to amplify the stats of his receivers in the same way that other quarterbacks might, especially when you consider what the Bills are trying to do with their offense currently. This is a guy in Shakir where you're not going to get hardly any air yards, but he was 4th in yards after the catch per game. Again, he's going to draw those targets. He's going to run with the ball. It's probably not the dynamism that is a game changer for them. That's a viable or valuable reality piece. It's probably not a game changer for you in fantasy either.
Yeah, I would not say game changer. We are definitely of the same mind on that. It's not a fun pick. It's not an attractive pick, but like you said, I think every once in a while I will take Khalil Shakir in a best ball draft just to see what happens there, what happens with the Buffalo offense. Buffalo is a team that once again fell short in trying to get to the Super Bowl this past year, to those hated Kansas City Chiefs. Oh, excuse me, those lovable Kansas City Chiefs. I forgot who's on the show tonight. Shawn, Travis Kelce has announced on his New Heights podcast that he is indeed coming back for 2025. It will be his 13th NFL season. We all know that it was a down year in 2024 for him, but a down year for Travis Kelce is still a pretty good year for most tight ends, mere mortals in the NFL. The ADP in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament has not necessarily reflected this yet, but Kelce is tight end 11 at the 812. I think anybody who took the chance, as I cautioned people not to do like a week or two ago on this program, they're loving life right now because they got a good deal on them. People, who drafted them the last day or two still got a good deal on them. But how much of a good deal is it? What are you expecting for Travis Kelce in 2025? I think he returns, given the horrible tight end position we've seen year after year. I think he returns tight end 11 value. I think he returns 8th round value. And he, quite frankly, is not going to go there anymore. He's going to go higher. But how high is too high for Kelce this year, knowing what we saw last year and knowing that Kelce is not only going to have to fend off Xavier Worthy for targets for an entire season, but Rashee Rice for most of the season after he comes off his suspension or purported suspension as well.
Yeah, I think when you combine the two elements, that he's a shell of his former self and they're going to finally have really dynamic receiver play if both of those guys stay healthy. Now, NFL teams don't necessarily stay healthy, so you could fall back into a decent situation at any time. But, I mean, this is one where, again, you tend to be pretty emotional about it if you are a Chiefs fan. It hurts because he's clearly one of the all-time greats, and yet last year he didn't look like he was dropping off slightly. He looked like he was in absolute free fall. And so then you're looking at how much of this is just that I want him to be better. Well, SIS had him as barely above replacement level in 2024. And then you look at some of the specific things that happened with him, and we know that he's going to be an underneath threat. We know the Chiefs right now just throw underneath relentlessly. But if you look at his ADOT specifically on completions, he was at 6 in 2021 and 2022. That fell to 5.6 in 2023 and then created a 4.8 in 2024. And that occurred at the same time that this guy who was so dynamic with the ball in his hands that you didn't want him to catch these short passes because the catch and run was going to kill you. The evasion numbers on him, so broken tackles plus forced missed tackles per reception, 30% 4 years ago to 22% to 19% to 3%. And then you think, again, back to the Super Bowl, the main thing that happened there was the Chiefs couldn't block anybody. But you had guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Travis Kelce running across the line of scrimmage, and when the ball came to them, I mean, they could barely put their arms out. Again, this is not what you want to see from great players, and it's not the way you want to see great players go out. Is there a little bit of a bump next year? Can he hold some of that? I don't know. I guess I'm pretty scared of this, both in reality and in fantasy, because if there is competition, the peripherals, the behind the raw numbers, I mean, they just suggest that Travis Kelce is not very good, that even what he did last year is mostly just on Patrick Mahomes and the fact they had nobody else to throw the ball to.
Would you draft him as a top 12 tight end this year?
I don't think so. My draft approach at tight end is to really more or less hammer not always the elite guys, not always the most expensive guys, but the players that you expect. And this is what you're trying to do with, obviously, with every position, but I'm sort of more targeted with tight end, where you have a handful of people in that elite range and hopefully to the back of the elite range where you're like, these guys are going to break out, they're going to crush ADP, and then I'm going to look for breakout players. I'm not really looking for production that sort of mirrors ADP at the tight end position. I think one of my favorite things about the FFPC is that tight end is so important that you want to dominate that position across all of the FFPC formats, but you also want to be thinking about the tight end as being flex viable. You need to hit on a guy who's going to destroy the competition at that spot in the starting lineup, and a second player who's going to allow you flexibility in a managed league, or in best ball is going to occasionally jump in and hit your flex position on those weekly scores. I don't think that Travis Kelce really fulfills any of your objectives in fantasy in 2025.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Maybe I haven't divorced the name from the expected numbers yet. And once I do that, maybe I'll be happier. But I do like the idea of once you get into that Kelce area, hey, let's go with an upside guy. Let's not go with a guy that is going to maybe pay off or maybe not pay off, especially a guy. I always say it's a young man's game, Shawn, and Travis Kelce is not a young man anymore. And yet you look at some of these younger guys or some of these other guys that are going right around Kelce. Tucker Kraft, Dalton Kincaid, Colston Loveland is another guy too. Will they pay off? I don't know, but I don't know the ceiling for them either. And it might be significantly higher, bite my tongue, than Travis Kelce. is in 2025. We are overdue for a break. Let's do this. Let's pop out, catch our breath, get a drink, and then when we come back, let's start talking rookies, Shawn. I want to get your thoughts on the backfield. We'll start with the running backs. We'll get into the quarterbacks as well. He's Shawn Siegele from RotoViz, Eric Balkman from the FFPC. This is a high-stakes fantasy football show on the Better Sports Network. We roll on right after this.
Andrew Cooper here of Fantasy Alarm, and if you're anything like me, football season never ends. Super Bowl's over. Who cares? We got the combine. We got the draft. We got free agency coming up here. We got a lot of speculation to do. And the best way to take advantage of that is at myffpc.com. Mock drafts are fun. They're fine. But if you really want to get leverage, get in one of their never too early best ball drafts or never too early super flex drafts now, where you can take advantage of all your takes. I'm in there now because I got hunches, right? I got ideas for free agency. I got ideas for the drafts. I got ideas for the 2025 NFL season, and I want to get them on paper now. And I want to do so before the NFL draft, right? Before the cat's out of the bag. That's the beauty of these contests, right? You go in and you get set up, and the drafts are already going, and they end on April 24th, right when the NFL draft starts. So you can get in there, get all your takes in, take advantage of everything before everybody finds out what happens. Use promo code ALARM at myffpc.com when you get set up. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more, and you can get in these tournaments, the never too early best ball and the never too early super flex contest, to get your shot at $10,000 or $40,000 grand prizes.
More fantasy football content for your late February fantasy football mind here on the High Stakes Fantasy Show on the Better Sports Network. Eric Balkman, Shawn Siegele coming at you tonight. We've been citing all these FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball and Superflex Best Ball tournaments ADPs. Shout out to Fantasy Mojo, Darren Armani. Anytime we get the ADP, it's always coming from him on this show. You too can utilize all the content, everything that Shawn's spilling his guts on tonight as far as player evaluation. Utilize it to your benefit. The $125 that you have in your pocket could turn into $40,000 when you enter it into the FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball Tournament. $35 entry fee for the Superflex version. These tournaments are going to be rolling on through April 24th, and then they will stop. They already started, and they will stop on April 24th, the day that the NFL draft starts as well. myffpc.com, myffpc.com is where to go for that. You can draft with 30-second, 60-second, 2-hour, or 6-hour clocks. We've talked a lot about veterans there in that first segment, and we're almost already halfway done with the show, which is it's crazy how fast time goes by. Rookie running backs. Everybody says this is the class. I shouldn't say everybody. A lot of people say this is the class, Shawn. I think back to the Christian McCaffrey year. I don't think this year's class is as top heavy as that one was with McCaffrey, Fournette. Aaron Jones was in that class as well. I know I'm missing a ton of them. Kamara, I want to say. But when you look at this class as a whole, maybe not spectacular, but very deep. And I don't think you necessarily need to be spectacular at running back. You just need the opportunity. And I see a lot of guys, maybe 5, maybe 6 guys on this list right now that are not spectacular talents. Well, maybe one guy's a spectacular talent, but the rest of them could be absolutely crushing it if they get the opportunity. And that's what makes this class so exciting. How do you look at this year's crop of running backs coming into the NFL?
I think it's pretty exciting. The class at the other positions, I would say, is not very strong. So I don't know that we're going to get the ultimate combined impact that we've gotten from some classes. I had an article up on the site during the season last year, ranking the last 10 rookie classes. That one was pretty fun. I need to jump back in and see how well that held up sort of down the stretch of the season. I don't know. I think it could be very special. And one of the things that was interesting here, now that we have just so much information, a lot of these top guys put up a really fast max time during a real football game last year in college. Now, we know that most of those are going to come from long runs. So partly what you have to do to get those types of times, you got to have a breakaway opportunity. Sometimes those come against weaker teams. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have the elite type of explosiveness. Obviously, we're just days away from getting so much more fun information, especially as it relates to the backs. How explosive are these guys actually? A lot of their peripherals are fantastic. So if they turn out to have the athleticism that I'm hoping, I don't know. I mean, you could have there are 4 or 5 guys who in many classes might be the RB1. It's so much fun coming off of this season where, especially the first half of the year, it really seemed like such a sea change in the way points were being scored, lineups were working. Certainly one of the great things about the FFPC, where you have the dual flex, when you can start 4 running backs, you have so much flexibility in terms of how you build those rosters out. Then we get a little bit more back to normal as we go through, and certainly because it can be difficult to get those star wide receivers. I mean, those receivers are still top. I think that this rookie class, though, one of the things that is so much fun is it could just eviscerate the veteran group when we're thinking about the value that so many of those guys have. I always assume, or I really started doing this very seriously in 2013, sort of at the birth of RotoViz, and every year it seems like as you go into the draft, the teams that don't have running backs and could potentially get a difference maker will select one of those guys, and the teams that already have an above average or certainly a dynamic starter are going to use the picks at more important positions. Then after the draft, you're like, well, this team still doesn't have any. This team has 3. That part of it is always frustrating. At the same time, it's just something that you really have to focus on in drafts right now, because this class is too talented, and it's too talented deep, right? I mean, you think about how weak last year's class was and what Bucky Irving still did, what Tyrone Tracy still did. I mean, you have guys who could potentially do some of those things coming from, 15 guys deep. And that makes it fun.
I looked up the 2017 running back class. McCaffrey, Aaron Jones, Dalvin Cook, Kamara, Mixon, Fournette, James Conner, Kareem Hunt, amongst others. That was a doozy. To your point about this year's class, and I was ticked off about last year's 2024 rookie running backs because I drafted, I don't want to say heavily, but I had a lot of Blake Corum, right? I had a lot of Trey Benson on my teams last year because I wasn't convinced Kyron Williams and James Conner are going to stay healthy. And now I have to wait till 2025 to see some ROI on that. This year, would you advise people in best ball drafts, early best ball drafts, pre-NFL draft, best ball draft, Shawn, would you advise people, maybe you want to have 2 running backs on your team by the end of the 3rd round? Maybe 2 by the end of the 4th, just because once you get outside that top 15, maybe the top 20, things get a little bit dicey when you don't know what the roles are going to be for these guys. Bring it up just a couple of years ago, whatever it was that 2023? And we thought Ken Walker was a locked-in, loaded, hey, let's go. And then the Seahawks utilized the 2nd-round pick on Zach Charbonnet. Charbonnet is not as talented, in my opinion, as a lot of these guys at the top of this year's class. And to that end, if Kenneth Walker wasn't safe then, there should be a lot of running backs, veteran running backs, that are not safe now.
No, and one of the things that they said about that was that Charbonnet was too talented. They couldn't pass on him. And then a bunch of the guys who were drafted after Charbonnet at running back were much better. If you're a reality team, you've got to wait. But they won't, or maybe they finally will, because they're looking at it as being so deep, right? Reality teams, even though they get 1 out of 32, barring all the different trade elements, versus 1 out of 12, you're still trying to hit the last guy in a tier. And there are some deep and talented tiers this year that could allow a lot of these guys to fall, but they're going to fall and still be on rosters, right? So I think, and again, I mean, you talk about rookie derangement syndrome, you worry about putting together rosters that even though they have a lot of talent, they don't have the right mix to win a never too early tournament, even if you hit on a lot of guys. I think this year's rookie class is so good that you need to wait. You need to build your best ball team in the way that our tools, the roster construction explorers, are going to tell you work. And then you just get all of these free value, not free values, but you have rookies who, I mean, they're just going to be difference makers. And you're going to want those guys above players who were drafted earlier. And you're going to want to build your team such that you have the wide receiving and tight end firepower to take advantage when these rookie running backs hit.
Speaking of rookie running backs, let's start off with this question for you about Ashton Jeanty, who, by the way, running back 6 in the never too early tournament right now with the FFPC. He's going at the 204. If I told you that Jeanty busts, at least this season, let's just say he's a bust in 2025, it never comes together for him, he does not return on his value, what will be the reason? And let's get rid of injury. Let's take injury out of it. If he stays healthy all the season and he busts, what's the reason he's going to bust? If he does.
I would think it would be a situation where his team needed him and then used him in a way that makes it much more difficult to be successful. You're not going to have that many situations where a team like the Green Bay Packers overuses a player like Josh Jacobs and it still mostly works out to everyone's benefit, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a guy who had a 35% evasion rate in 2023. It's just behind Bijan Robinson's epic number for 2021. Then he goes out and crushes the numbers in 2024, where he has 84 broken tackles, 28 more than he had in 2023, which in and of itself was the third best of the last 5 years. Now, you look at him and you're saying there are some elements that we might want to do to adjust for the caliber of competition, but you can't do much more than put up the craziest numbers that we've seen in a long time as both a rusher and a receiver. I talked about guys hitting top speed, perhaps in part because he was able to create those breakaway runs. He gets to top speed, but huge numbers in terms of mile per hour on the field last year. I guess I just don't see this as a potential miss. If you told me that he busts and stays healthy, that would just be absolutely shocking to me. I don't know that we've had a guy with this much safety and this much upside in a long time. And that includes, some of the guys like a Bijan Robinson. So yeah, I think he's going to hit. I think he's a pretty fun value where he is going, where you've got to just pay up and pay up and pay up.
I can't remember if I said this story on this show, but I was in this Dynasty league where I was kind of a fringe playoff team. And week 14, I forgot to insert Brock Purdy in for Lamar Jackson. And with the points, I mean, obviously Jackson was on bye. And with the points that Purdy scored that week, I would have gotten the win. And we played victory points in that league. I would have gotten the win. And I also would have had enough points to elevate myself into the last playoff spot. And I played it out because it's total points after that. It's not head to head. And I would have finished runner up in the league, Shawn, if I would have made that decision properly to start Purdy. Because I didn't, my team went on a tear in the consolation bracket, and I ended up winning the number 1 overall pick in the rookie draft. So now here's the conundrum. Would I have rather had a runner-up finish last year, or would I have rather had Ashton Jeanty this year, which is probably what I'm going to do? Obviously, I've forgotten about last season already. I'm excited to have Jeanty, but that's an interesting conversation. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what I should have been rooting for at that point.
Yeah, Ben and I were lucky enough that one of the picks we traded for won the back.
Turned into the 101. Oh, that's
yeah. And
God bless you.
I love that element. Colin and I talk about that on OT constantly, how that is, if nothing else, if all the other great features don't convince you, that's why you have to play FFPC Dynasty. We got a trade offer today And again, our team is loaded, except we have Tua and Derek Carr at QB. Loaded. We got an offer for a pretty good QB and the 111 for the 101. I won't go into too much more in the way of details, for privacy for that manager, especially as things are going along, but we're probably not going to take it.
Yeah.
And partly, I've done a lot of work on the site talking about how quarterbacks are overvalued in Superflex. I think that's an interesting discussion kind of separately. We're comfortable starting a terrible QB and then playing a position player in the Superflex spot, right? So if you have one of these running backs, would you prefer to have them, especially with the slightly mitigated QB scoring in that format? Would you prefer just to play? Had this amazing, massively lucky season this year where the 9 FFPC, 8 of them RB Triflex leagues, won 5, and so many of them were Bo Nix solo QB teams. If you haven't tried that path and you want to do something a little bit crazy with your dynasty teams, think about playing one QB and maybe playing well. And if I'm not mistaken, we also did plenty of content based on our roster construction explorer talking about how you want to go out and approach the Superflex best ball tournament, maybe from 0 QB. It builds a little bit, on the 0 RB ideas there. My understanding is the team that won the tournament may have been starting a bad QB and only one QB in the doesn't mean that they didn't have some QB scoring along the way. You've got to get there, but use some creativity when you attack these Superflex formats. They're so much fun, whether you have multiple stars or you have nobody. The fact that you can craft teams that are going to be successful and that's part of the contest. I don't know. Everything should be Superflex.
Yeah, no, it does add an extra element of fun. No question. We've talked about Genty. I have heard from people, not a lot, but I've heard from some people that they believe Omarion Hampton is the 1B to Ashton Genty's 1A this year. Do you believe that Hampton is that close to Genty, or is there a significant chasm between Genty and Hampton, even if I don't even know if Hampton's your number 2 running back for rookies this year, Shawn?
Yeah, it's tricky because you have a lot of guys, I think, that you can make some compelling arguments for. He obviously had the fantastic 2 seasons at a good age, experience, adjusted trajectory there. The evasion rate in 2022 in 2023 was a bit of a red flag. That jumped to 26%, again, the way SIS does it in 2024. I feel a lot more comfortable with that. And then with that, you have very good numbers in yards after contact. You have the big plays. You have the total production. You have all of these routes that he brought with it as well. You have not just the receptions, but explosive plays on these receptions, a lot of additional evaded tackles on those plays. When we look at him in our box score scout, we get comps like Dalvin Cook, Breece Hall, Cam Akers. Yeah, I mean, those, especially if you still believe that Breece Hall can hit at the level that he should have if he hadn't gotten hurt and hadn't had to play with the Jets, then Dalvin Cook, Breece Hall, those are names where you're like, yeah, I could see that guy just as the top prospect.
Interesting. TreVeyon Henderson. I don't know what it's been. Okay. This is my truth about TreVeyon Henderson. I remember being very excited about him at this point last year. Well, I shouldn't say this point last year, maybe 13 months ago, when I believed he was going to be in the NFL draft. And then he decided to come back to Ohio State. Okay. I guess I got to wait a year on Henderson. And then Quinshon Judkins comes to Ohio State and forms a nice tandem with them, where Henderson was never, the bell cow there. He didn't have to be the bell cow there. Maybe he could have been, but he didn't have to be. And Ohio State rode that to a national title. And now this year, I haven't heard much about him. And now it seems like the pundits out there are picking up steam for Henderson again and starting to say, hey, we need to look at this guy. This guy is going to be a great pro, 3-down guy. He can do it all. How do you fall in on Henderson? It sounds like you're putting him on that same, at least level with Hampton, maybe not ahead of him, but on that same level.
I think that he can be in that group. I'm probably a little bit biased from recent discussions with Travis. We had him on OT. Anybody wants to check him out, he's just absolutely extraordinary. He was very high on him. I like the guys. I mean, you really would prefer to have just a spotless resume. But if you're going to have some concerns, you would love to have an amazing instant breakout, which he had with huge numbers there as a freshman. And then you'd love to have a great final season, which he also had, right? He's not going to be a prolific tackle breaker with the way that he runs, but there is a Jahmyr Gibbs element to that. One of the things that's been crazy about Gibbs, and it's just been so exciting, his evasion numbers have actually been better against NFL competition than they were against collegiate competition, especially, adjusting for what the expectation would be there. You have Henderson, you contrast him with Judkins, who I think is probably the guy who could end up being maybe the undervalued member of the group. I'm very high on him as well, but you look at their different profiles and you're thinking, okay, Judkins is the guy who can be the evasion, the tackle breaker type of player. Henderson, 3.9 yards after contact. Judkins, 2.9 last season. Henderson averages 2 more yards per attempt. He triples him in points above average per attempt. Those guys obviously are knocking down each other's just raw totals a little bit. But again, when you look at Henderson, the first year, the last year, you look at him compared to another elite prospect, I think that he is a guy who, when we look at this class in several years, I mean, just like with Jahmyr Gibbs, where it's really hard to not have him as maybe the best running back in the entire NFL. I mean, there are going to be a lot of people competing for this title a few years from now, but Henderson is certainly a name that you want to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think for sure. And you said you were higher on Judkins than most, Shawn?
Well, you get the almost 1,700 scrimmage yards as a freshman, right? So again, you get that immediate breakout. And then in year 2, his yards per attempt craters were always a little bit concerned if you can't put up good yards per attempt numbers against collegiate competition. But we always do want to be thinking through what the context was as well. And his 52 tackles broken. So 52 broken tackles during that year where his numbers otherwise don't look very good. Those are the most for any power conference back. Obviously, a few other guys have beaten it overall, but the most for any power conference back in the last 5 years. When you're talking about elite young production and then some of these peripherals, I think that some of what you really could probably consider red flags from his final season there at Ohio State, those don't bother me as much when I know what he did coming into that season.
Caleb Johnson is also another running back from a power school. And unlike Travion Henderson, who also plays in the Big Ten, I didn't hear a whole lot about Caleb Johnson at this time last year. Fast forward 12 months, 1,500 plus yards, 20 plus touchdowns, also caught 22 balls and caught 2 touchdowns as well. I think that if I had to put my money on one of these running backs being the fastest at the combine, Caleb Johnson would not be in my top 5, but he's a big guy and he's been able to utilize that power. Power does play in the NFL. How much emphasis do you put on Caleb Johnson lacking the top end speed that some of these other guys have that are going to go around him in the draft probably on day 2? When you consider where you would put him in your rankings right now, when you consider whether you draft him or not, knowing that he's probably not going to run away from anybody, knowing that the NFL seemingly has put this emphasis on exciting, big time, explosive playmakers. Caleb Johnson's not that, but that's not to say he can't be a viable fantasy asset. How do you fall in on him?
Yeah, the explosion there will be interesting because, you mentioned the raw numbers, his peripherals, just pretty crazy. 936 yards after contact, 36 broken tackles, 23 forced missed tackles. SIS has those 2 separately. And Blair's research suggests that forced missed tackles might be even a little bit more exploitable. Broken tackles, probably a little bit more indicative. 71 first downs, a receiver rating of 122, 124 receiving yards after contact. What more can a back really go out there and do? That just checks all of those boxes. he's another player where maybe a little bit wider range of outcomes, but instant impact, a lot of production. If he lands on top of a guy you already have, it's not going to be good.
No, it's not. And the other thing too is he's one of those players that if he does land in an NFL situation where there's already a semi-established guy, like he's not going to be the third down guy. Like he's going to be the banger. He's going to be the between the tackles guy. And I would imagine he'd be getting more in the volume. Now, that may not still mean that that's the guy you want on that team. But that does take away a lot from, whoever the incumbent running back was on that, on whatever team that he gets drafted by. So that's definitely something to be paying attention to. Let's get in a time machine here, Shawn, and let's fast forward 4 years. When somebody says the name Cam Scatabo to you 4 years from now, will you be saying, God, I can't put together a package in order to get him. I can't pry him away from any of my league mates. Or will you be saying, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. Which is it going to be?
I think probably the first.
Really?
We don't have him ranked as high in the rookie guide as I have him in my own rankings. I have gotten plenty of pushback on being enthusiastic about him from folks, which has been interesting to me. I don't know. I mean, you got the insane totals, right? And people tend to know what those are. But it's not that he was like this dude who benefited from some perfect situation and just had a number of attempts that made it inevitable. He edged GT in points above average per attempt, in part because he had a much higher positive percentage, but he also had a 30% evasion rate, which again is off the charts, and his 1,144 rushing yards after contact were the most among power conference runners in the last 5 years. And that's before you add in all of the receiving stuff. I love his bio on the ASU page because it talks about how he's done all of these things that like only Adrian Peterson and Christian McCaffrey have done. I mean, he's not those two guys, but there's a point at which if you have the minimum ability, and that's the thing that people do seem to question, is whether he has the minimum ability. For me, the minimum ability question is somewhat answered by the fact that you did this against college guys who, I mean, the college level is fairly high. Now it's very different in the NFL, but I mean, David Montgomery, right? I mean, this is David Montgomery supercharged, at least in terms of what you're looking at numbers wise here. We have a lot of backs in the NFL who are not that athletic and have made it because a team liked them and then trotted them out there over and over and over. When you're thinking about Joe Mixon, you're thinking about Josh Jacobs, you're thinking about David Montgomery. It's unfair of me to say that it's purely volume, what they're doing. As I wrote the Zero RB universe this year, I tried to make sure that I feathered in as many compliments as possible, talk about the things that these guys do that you don't get from, say, Zach Moss, right? Someone who had some similar peripherals in college, but just, you can play him. He's not that level of player. But at the same time, we're not talking about guys who are Barry Sanders or Marshawn Lynch. I mean, Marshawn Lynch closer to that. You're not talking about somebody who's going to run 80 yards for a touchdown like a Gibbs or a Barkley, a Jonathan Taylor. You prefer to have that, but there's certainly space, or at least the Green Bay Packers thought there was space. The Detroit Lions, even though they have one of those guys, continues to run out David Montgomery and pay him more. I mean, your worst case scenario is that he gets in that David Montgomery role and he just takes the numbers from a certain player to keep like his teammates or his team's Jahmyr Gibbs from being like a 30-point per game scorer. I mean, we've seen Gibbs by himself. That's what I want to see for all the stars. But maybe, I don't know. I love this guy. Am I missing something there in terms of?
Here's the thing. number one, and this I'm guilty of this as well. I didn't watch a ton of Arizona State football this past season. You know what I did see? The Texas game. And I know in my mind, I don't want to double count what I saw in that game based on what type of running back he is. I think there is a certain amount of, so number one, the evasion rate, you're right. It's unbelievable. I think we saw a little bit of that in Texas, but I guess what stands out in my mind from that Texas game is him moving the pile and him just showing this raw strength that I didn't see from a lot of running backs this year. And then when you consider he's 5'11", 215, I think people are like, well, wait a minute, that's not like a bruiser size, you know? And I'll say this too. And I'm not saying that I'm falling in line with this. It's weird to see a white running back doing what he did. And I think that some people have a hard time. If you look at mock drafts out there, Shawn, where is Scatabo? He's never higher than fifth, maybe fourth and one. There's a lot of people that are putting him ahead of, or there's a lot of people that are putting him significantly behind some of these other running backs in this class. And for a guy who did what he did, was as electric as he did, was as exquisite a pass catcher as he was, not only this year and last year, I think there gets to be signed some sort of groupthink that goes with this. Like, well, okay, I can't be on Scatabo Island here. I clearly am missing something. To your point, maybe you're not missing anything, and maybe this guy does come out and crush it.
Yeah, I think that fantasy managers have it in the general vicinity that is correct, and that he's gapped down from all of these potential stars, but he's going to be good. And if you're getting a discount because there are only so many rookie running backs who are going to be drafted at high levels in never too early tournaments, then he becomes a little bit of a cheat code.
Listen, Scatabo and cheat code, I think will go together if he hits, because this guy is, I mean, the numbers that he was able to put up against, again, high level competition. This is a power conference guy that won. It was on a team that won their conference. And keep in mind too, there's I can't remember who it was. The stud Arizona State receiver who got hurt towards the end of the season. Like, this was Scatabo carrying this team, literally dragging it into the quarterfinals of the college football playoffs. So sometimes players like that, if you underrate them, you're making that mistake and you're putting it out there and you'll suffer for it. Let's move on. Devin Neal had a pretty good Senior Bowl. He was with Kansas the last 2 years, 1,200 plus yards in each year, 16 plus touchdowns in each year. He also averaged 25 catches for the last couple of years. I drafted him in a best ball tournament, or not best ball tournament, just a best ball league a couple of earlier this week. And one of the things I remember in my Neal scouting was that I don't think this guy is going to set the world on is going to set the track on fire at the combine, because I didn't think he was all that fast. And now I'm hearing, well, yeah, actually, speed could be one of his strengths. And if speed's one of his strengths, this is another guy that I'm really a big fan of, a well-rounded running back who, again, sky's the limit if he gets to the NFL. I just don't know if the speed element is there like some people say it's going to be.
That's interesting, because he does seem like the guy who's merely solid and solid everywhere. And it's been hard for me to get excited about him, even though, again, kind of as a Kansas City guy, it's Chiefs and then it's Jayhawks basketball that are the two things that I grew up with. Being on Kansas, I'd love for him to, I mean, frankly, they don't put in a ton of elite pro prospects, obviously, but I had a hard time finding that trait that suggests that he will be more than a solid depth piece at the NFL level. And yet, at a certain point, merely being incredibly solid and someone who is good at everything, if not great, someone you can count on for this level of consistency, because he was incredibly consistent at Kansas. And then just, a fun little stat for him, his 3.4% bust rate in 2023 was extremely, extremely low. That gave him points above average per attempt numbers that were above guys like Ray Davis and Jonathan Brooks. Now, again, that's not to say that he's better, obviously, but someone who is that consistently accomplishing what teams want to do. Now, we're in a bit of a shift where I think more teams are understanding that what you actually want to do with your running backs is you need to create explosive plays, right? The total production from Saquon isn't what's that valuable. It's the explosive plays. Same things for guys like Jahmyr Gibbs. I think that some teams potentially are going to be caught making mistakes. We just raved about someone who probably, again, is more of a try-hard player who helps you move the ball slowly down the field. I mean, the Chiefs have illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of that. And, I mean, they're a team, if they get one of these guys, I think it would be really exciting. Now, I say one of these guys, one of the top guys.
Right.
But when you're thinking about historically what teams have valued at the running back position, I mean, in a different class, we would look at Neal differently. He kind of disappears in this class, or at least I think he does. If you're looking at the spreadsheet, it certainly seems like the real football people like him.
And to your point, if he gets that opportunity, and he's not really weak anywhere, opportunity is king with running backs. Maybe he's not the most exciting player, but he definitely should not let you down. Let me ask you this. Dylan Sampson took over for Jalen Wright in Tennessee in 2024. Who do you think is going to make the better pro prospect? Jalen Wright or Dylan Sampson?
Well, that's interesting because a big part of my write-up was just comparing them, even though obviously Sampson emerges in 2024, basically does a lot of those same things, again, on much higher volume. You'd love to see the high volume, but he was better than Wright in 2023 in points above average per attempt, in positive rate, in boom rate, in bust rate. He had the superior evasion rate. He was better in terms of yards per route, all of those different types of things. And now you look at some of the things that he did this past season, and you think about him as another potentially explosive player. He's another one of these guys that at least once was able to log a really fast time during an actual college game. We have him pretty enthusiastically ranked, in part because one of our rankers loves him. I really like where he's going in drafts because he probably gives you most of what some of the more expensive backs do, or at least the gap shouldn't be what it is, right? And so if you get that and then you hit, say, an 80th percentile outcome, now you're off to the races.
I want to skedaddle through these last guys here. Ollie Gordon II, DJ Giddens, RJ Harvey, and then anybody else that you want to talk about. Out of those three guys and the rest of the field, is there anybody that you're particularly excited about, or maybe a little bit higher on than some of your peers?
Yeah, well, just to quickly hit those players, I mean, there are lots of sleepers that I think you definitely want to check out, and we cover at length in the guide. But Gordon, obviously, he has the amazing 2023, 2024 catastrophic. But even with that, his yards after contact were up slightly. His stuff percentage was slightly better, even though he was hit at the line an incredibly high percentage of that. So he's one of these guys a little bit like Kyren Williams, where I think the context covers up, the final season context covers up where he was. Kyren Williams, obviously someone who should have been drafted much, much earlier. Giddens, he's got you watch him play and it's like, oh, well, these are exactly where all these peripherals come from, right? He had a fantastic evasion rate in 2023. He catches all of those passes. He was one of a handful of players to log 2 of the fastest times in college football last year. He's a fantastic receiver. I think that in a different draft, he would be a guy everybody is talking about. And then you mentioned Harvey. I probably have the wrong take on him, but he's a guy a little bit like Neal, where you have those very solid numbers throughout. The evasion rates right where you'd want to see them, especially for a guy with his profile. And it's not just one season, 2022, 2023, 2024. You have last year with the 150 yards from scrimmage per game, the 25 touchdowns. I mean, they know he's coming. Yeah, maybe there's some things they're doing to boost him. At the same time, I mean, he's the whole team, and yet he's still doing those things. He and Giddens remind me a little bit of what you get from Irving, where the ability to change direction without slowing, and you make the guy miss, and then you continue. I mean, some of the things that we see from the tackle breakers are that they'll break that tackle, they'll generate the great evasion numbers, but they'll stop their feet. And even if you're talking about the predictiveness of some of these numbers being very good, it's still yards that you care about, right? So when you see guys like Giddens and Harving who change direction and don't slow down, I mean, that's what Irving was able to do. And Irving made it work despite terrible. I mean, you're talking about a guy who is small and like objectively unathletic, but the part of that wasn't actually mattered was you could change direction without slowing down. I think that you see a little bit of that from these guys. Hopefully I'm not just making up because I like them.
Well, and I think, listen, with as deep as this running back class is, we could probably talk about more players that we're big fans of this year. Maybe not players that are going to go on day 1 or day 2, but day 3 guys that could make a difference as well. And we've seen those day 3 guys be fantasy worthy right away their rookie year too. I do want to talk about the quarterbacks here and power through this. Are you team Cam Ward or are you team Shedeur Sanders?
Probably Ward. They both have some interesting numbers. I mentioned Travis a couple times. His scheme-adjusted QB research is absolutely fantastic. I do a little bit of a shortcut on that in the work that I do, where I'm looking at throws where you don't have jet motion, you don't have play action, you're throwing at least 6 yards down the field. You're comparing guys on like vaguely apples to apples types of throws. And Ward's numbers are really good. In number 1, and he had a lot of these types of throws. And then number 2, you look at 2024, second highest boom rate, the lowest bust rate. He can, I think, very clearly play. I think he's someone who probably doesn't get you that fired up from a fantasy perspective, but he's going to be a good player. And if you're needing that super flex guy, you always have to decide what your risk profile is in terms of, I'm only going to take a quarterback if they could be a league crusher, or I'm only going to take a quarterback if they have a strong chance to hit, or just what your mix is. I like him. Sanders, a player where he's got great numbers on catchable balls, right? He's got strong accuracy on third down, on deep passes. You love to see those elements, but like the movement portion of it is horrifying from the perspective of sacks and then what you might get as a fantasy player. I mean, you don't really want to take Jared Goff because Jared Goff has to throw for 5,050 to move the needle for you. Maybe what we've seen in college from him isn't going to be the same as what you see at the NFL level, but some of these concerns, and you go back and forth on, is it the receivers that matter, where he's probably pretty loaded at receiver? Is it the offensive line that matters, where probably they're not particularly strong? But the QB has to limit the sacks. If you're taking so many sacks, and that's where your other good numbers are coming from, that's a bit of a problem. I think Ward looks better when you comp that. And then most of the things that we're seeing with them is just quite a bit more arm talent from Ward.
I know Sanders is the book on him is he's so accurate. But I think Cam Ward, that there's a little bit of Jameis Winston to his game, a little bit where he's going to pump the ball down the field. He's going to try to make something out of nothing, which isn't always the greatest thing when it comes to being an NFL quarterback. But I do think for fantasy wise, that gets me a little bit more excited than Shedeur Sanders. And I think Sanders is a little bit more calculated, maybe a little bit more cautious in when he picks and chooses his windows to throw in. Is there one guy outside of those two that has separated himself as the number 3 quarterback for you in this class? Or is it kind of like, you asked me one day, it could be Dart. You asked me the next day, it could be Milroe. How do you fall in on the number 3 quarterback in this class?
That's going to be fascinating from the perspective of where they're drafted. I mean, we know that matters a huge amount for everybody, but the starting opportunity is going to be a big deal. For Dart, one of the things that you see is that when you do some of these scheme adjustments, the numbers look pretty good. And some of the concerns people have with him, I guess I'm less worried about. He's a very aggressive vertical passer, and then the numbers on those passes are extremely strong. We know how that is very helpful for NFL quarterbacks being able to get the ball down the field. Maybe I say maybe there's a developmental aspect to it, or just being comfortable with an NFL scheme where you wouldn't start the first half of the season. But I mean, frankly, if these guys are good, you need to get them out there. Milroe is a weird one where I kind of had mentioned at the very top of the show that contrast with someone like an Anthony Richardson. And he's probably not fully to that level as an athletic freak, and yet his on-field times, his rushing numbers are pretty crazy. I think you got to be excited about that. But then the other thing is that he has accuracy concerns that do show up in the numbers, in the charting, on a variety of different elements. And yet the scheme adjusted numbers for him in 2023, especially when he was probably in a more comfortable situation, maybe a little more talent around him, they were very similar to Drake May's numbers, right? And so we talk about the IQR on this specific cohort of passes, and he was up there at 126, a very good number. This past year, he fell to 106. The final season numbers, and I looked them up again today just to make sure because they seem kind of crazy, but Richardson 68, Levis 70. And we're talking about, I mean, these things are not comparable. I think there's a concern because some of the guys who are mobile quarterbacks and lack accuracy, that creates problems for your offense. It creates some problems for them, obviously, at Alabama. And yet, this is one where I see if you get a good price, it could be like the Jalen Hurts picks from a few years ago, where there was not the expectation that he's going to go in and be the starter. But then once he becomes that and you have the rushing, the pick that you used on him, I mean, it becomes someone who then is a top 10 overall super flex dynasty startup pick. That might be the way to play it. But again, you're talking about very wide ranges for what those players could end up being.
Those profiles and 80 plus more located at rotoviz.com. The 2025 RotoViz rookie draft guide is out. You can get it now, rotoviz.com. Shawn has done an extensive work on talking about a lot of the running backs, a lot of the quarterbacks we've discussed tonight, and so much more. In fact, let's pick Shawn's brain on some wide receivers and some tight ends after we take our final break. Don't forget about the FFPC Big Gorilla at myffpc.com. $1 million grand prize. Drafts going off right now. 3-pack for $1,000. The early Rampage and 7 Bananas promotion. Encourage you to check that out at myffpc.com. It's basically 2 tournaments for the price of one. myffpc.com is where to go for that. We're talking Tet McMillan, Emeka Egbuka, Travis Hunter, and so much more with RotoViz's own Shawn Siegele. We will be back right after this on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show.
Andrew Cooper here of Fantasy Alarm. And if you're anything like me, football season never ends. Super Bowl's over. Who cares? We got the combine. We got the draft. We got free agency coming up here. We got a lot of speculation to do. And the best way to take advantage of that is at myffpc.com. You know, mock drafts are fun. They're fine. But if you really want to get leverage, get in one of their never too early best ball drafts or never too early super flex drafts now, where you can take advantage of all your takes. I'm in there now because I got hunches, right? I got ideas for free agency. I got ideas for the drafts. I got ideas for the 2025 NFL season, and I want to get them on paper now. And I want to do so before the NFL draft, right? Before the cat's out of the bag. That's the beauty of these contests, right? You go in and you get set up, and the drafts are already going, and they end on April 24th, right when the NFL draft starts. So you can get in there, get all your takes in, take advantage of everything before everybody finds out what happens. Use promo code ALARM at myffpc.com when you get set up. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more, and you can get in these tournaments, the never too early best ball and the never too early super flex contest, to get your shot at $10,000 or $40,000 grand prizes.
Welcome back to the RotoViz, the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show, presented by the FFPC on the Better Sports Network, with RotoViz's own Shawn Siegele at FF_Contrarian. He has written along with Blair Andrews and Kevin Safraniak. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, we're gonna go with yes.
He co-hosted this show with me a month or two ago. And I asked him off air, I said, am I getting this right? And I could just tell he's too nice to tell me if I was getting it right or not. So like, he's just going to let me do whatever. But all that stuff in the RotoViz rookie draft guide right now, prospect comps, advanced metrics, rotoviz.com is where to get that. We talked a lot about the running backs, a lot about the quarterbacks in the previous segment. Let's talk about the wide receiver class. Before we touch on Tet McMillan, who's the first guy I want to bring up, the overview on this class, maybe similar to the running backs in that it's fairly deep, but again, not very top heavy. Is that the way that you see this class as well this year? And I'm worried it's thin.
I'm worried it's thin.
Okay, you're worried it's thin. And I do want to make it certain we are of the same mind that the running back class is better than the wide receiver crop this year, 100%. But you're worried that this is a thin class. Keep going with that thought.
I mean, it's basically McMillan, and then you have to hope, right? I mean, Burden is also going to be pretty interesting. You would love to see. I mean, Ben and I did a somewhat extended segment at one point recently on how, I mean, if you have Travis Hunter, you've got to figure out a way to, I mean, he's one of these guys where maybe you don't have the routes, but the targets per route number just breaks everything that has happened in the past, because when he's on the field, he's going to get the ball. Does that work at the NFL level? I don't know. I'm hoping he's drafted by a team that is creative enough to take advantage of sort of a transcendent player. We will see. If he's a superstar defensive back and a niche receiver, that will be disappointing, at least for fantasy managers.
Yeah, it might be great for whoever drafts him, but yeah, let me start off with Hunter, because I did draft him in a managed league on Super Bowl Sunday, actually, as like my number 5 wide receiver. And this was the effect of like, okay, I'm kind of shooting for the moon here. This may not pay off, but I want to get in now while I can, just to see what happens with Hunter. Do we need to be penalizing him in our drafts right now because he is working out? Well, I mean, he's listed as a corner for the combine. That doesn't mean he won't be doing wide receiver drills. Or no, I think he announced he's not doing anything at the combine this year. But just because he's listed as a corner doesn't mean he's not going to play wide receiver. How much have you moved him down your draft boards, knowing that there is much more of an imminent risk of him not playing wide receiver, as much as Burden, McMillan, Egbuka, Harris, Bond, Golden, the list goes on?
Yeah, I mean, he would be very clearly either just the runaway number 1, or at least in a tier with the top 3 guys. And so at some point, you just want that upside, right? And it doesn't, especially if you're talking about rookie drafts and, setting yourself up for those. How are you going to move around? How are you going to trade within it? Maybe it takes a year or two for the team to realize we've got a top 10 wide receiver in all of football. He's got to be out there. But if he is that, I just think that a team will use him, because, I mean, again, are you going to beat the super teams if you have that type of talent and you're sitting him on the bench? We'll see if it works. But what he's already done is to demonstrate the ability that is sort of unparalleled, right? So if you've done it already to a certain extent, I don't know if doubting a player of that capability is the way to go. I think you want to embrace talent. But one of the nice things about it is he's just not priced in a way that you're suffering this huge penalty where you have to have him hit. Now, when you're drafting best ball teams, it's just very important not to have holes and not to have voluntary holes. You don't know who's going to get hurt, but if you're selecting voluntary holes where it's basically someone who doesn't have snaps, that is a problem. So we want to think about best ball teams almost differently, where every single pick, it needs to matter. But again, people are drafting portfolios. If you think about those teams where you have him, he's substantially underpriced for what the upside is. Maybe that works for you and you're less worried about this whole element.
I hear a lot of people comparing Teteroa McMillan to Drake London. I don't know why. I have a little cold feet. Maybe it's helmet scouting. Not helmet scouting, on maybe regional scouting on my part. I get bust vibes from McMillan. And I don't know if it's because his separation wasn't great. I mean, quite frankly, he didn't have to separate because his catch radius is so big, and he's so good in those 50-50 balls, on those 50-50 balls. But I do have concerns about McMillan at the next level in how good his game will translate. Do you have those concerns? It sounds like you're pretty sold on this guy.
I'm excited for him. I live in Tucson, Arizona. So take that for what you will. I mean, this is a guy who, when you watch him, he has that same sort of change of direction ability that we just discussed for the running backs. And he has it at this wide receiver size, where he had the most air yards among power conference receivers last year, the second most over the last 2 seasons, trailing only what Adunze did the year before. He had big air yards numbers in 2023. He drew the most targets of at least 15 air yards in 2024. He was successful inside and out. He was successful on those slot opportunities. But one of the things that you see with him are a lot of broken and forced missed tackles, which you don't always get from players with this type of profile. So one of the things that was a big deal for me last year, looking at Malik Neighbors and contrasting him with Marvin Harrison, was that you had two players who could potentially be generational talents. One of them probably more polished, or at least that was the narrative about him, and maybe did the thing that he does well better, or to even a higher level. So you have this standout trait that is so extraordinary. But Neighbors had a lot more things that he did well. And you look at the different numbers for him, and you can say, well, I mean, he's playing with Jay Daniels, and we know what he is now, right? But you look at the variety of things that Neighbors brought to the table, including with the ball in his hands, and then those things, and there's no guarantee that then you're going to see exactly that same type of thing at the NFL level. We talked about with Richardson, there's no guarantee you're going to see the exact same thing. But what we did see was Neighbors was this dynamic all-around threat. You even think to the game there where catching passes from Drew Lock, he's taking everything the distance. You contrast that with Harrison, and I mean, the evasion tackle numbers for Harrison were almost invisible in college, which I think is somewhat surprising given what he otherwise accomplished, but then they were non-existent again last year with Arizona. Now, Kyler Murray has a lot of problems specifically as a passer, and so I don't think that you can say that it's all on Marvin Harrison. But when I'm looking at these receivers, I want to see good age-adjusted production. I want to see good overall production, but then I want to see guys who are doing a lot of different things well. I think McMillan is that.
Interesting.
We'll see how much of it is, again, that Arizona helmet you talked about.
Here's the thing. Okay, tell me if this comparison is fair. I know he didn't go to Arizona, but I think about N'Keal Harry, who went to Arizona State. And I know that they are different players, but I just get vibes, and that's what I'm saying, regional scouting rather than helmet scouting, because N'Keal Harry was a Sun Devil.
That's a lot of heartbreak there, mentioning N'Keal Harry and casual conversation.
Here's the thing. 3 weeks in a row, 4 weeks in a row, I have brought up Tet McMillan, and I brought up my concerns on this show to my guest co-host. And seemingly every single time, my concerns should be alleviated. And for whatever reason, they have been alleviated to a certain degree. But for whatever reason, still in the back of my head, Shawn, I'm like, yeah, that's fair. I still don't know. And now it's just becoming a gut thing for me. And I don't know if I'll be able to mentally get over that. And when Tet McMillan has a 70 catch for 1,200 yards and 10 touchdown season this year in his rookie year, I will be the one paying the cost of that because I will not have drafted him. Or maybe I will. We'll see what happens. I want to bring up Luther Burden. You talked about him briefly. 86 catches, 1,200 yards, 9 touchdowns in 2023. 2024, he gets 25 fewer catches. He gets almost half the receiving yards that he did the previous year at 676, and then only 6 touchdowns. Luther Burden, and a lot of the mocks that you saw at the end of the NFL draft in 2024, you saw Burden as the first receiver off the board in a lot of these mocks, and now he is not. Now it's McMillan. That's another thing. I don't remember McMillan from last year, and now all of a sudden everybody's T-Mac. But what about Burden? What happened to him? And it sounds like you have a level of concern for Burden as a pro as well.
Yeah, I mean, with him, you're getting a guy who has been extremely dynamic with the ball in his hands. You love that. In 2023, he was able to do a lot on his deep ball. Caught 21 of the 26 catchable deep balls, 0 drops, gains 617 yards, 17 yards, scores 5 touchdowns on those specific opportunities. You look at this last year, I think that Burden, even much more than McMillan, if he goes to sort of any or most upper half power conference teams, he's just going to be a clear top 10 pick. I mean, he gets crushed by the context here with Missouri. He only gets 22 deep targets in 2024. Only 12 of those are catchable. That portion, the lack of either the ability or the quarterback's ability, you can look at it from either perspective, but that crushes the overall results. The overall production makes him look like he had this collapsed season. It doesn't seem like, in talking with people who are really dialed into the college football element, and then you work through the numbers and you can easily craft explanations for why it happened. he's probably the same guy. He's probably an elite talent.
Okay. All right. So you're still on board the Burden train.
I am.
Okay, good. Emeka Egbuka, I can't separate how I feel about this guy. I think he has an extremely high floor. I think he's going to be a very productive pro, but I don't know if he's ever going to be that elite guy, that the game breaker, right? He played alongside a lot of game breakers at Ohio State. I think this past year, Jeremiah Smith, the year before that, Marvin Harrison Jr. And yet Egbuka is the all-time leading receiver in Buckeyes history. I'd hate to draft him if I'm an NFL team in the first round, knowing that, this guy will be my slot guy. He's going to catch 80, 85 balls a year. He's never going to be spectacular, but he's going to be really good. Maybe that's enough for fantasy. Or is there an upside here that I'm missing with Egbuka?
Yeah, the explanation for the lack of massive numbers comes from teammates. And yet, when you think about those slot elements you mentioned, he was a slot heavy guy. He does have a lot of yards after the catch as a result of that. Those things I think are valuable. And if you're talking about a guy who's going to be selected in the third round of the reality draft, probably a very solid pick. I keep getting hung up on some of the contrasts with different Ohio State wide receivers. And for example, all you have to do is go back to Jackson Smith and Jigba, who also played with fantastic talent around him, and the numbers that he was able to put up. He evaded 26 tackles in 2021. Egbuka has 26 evaded tackles in the last 3 years combined. If you're going to be that slot guy, someone who is catching these underneath passes, running after the catch, I think not that you have to, but it does benefit you to have more dynamism than it seems like he has.
I think we have, and I want to explore that more, but we're just running out of time, and I still want to get to tight ends here. I'm going to be selfish here and ask you about my Green Bay Packers. Shawn, the types of receivers that they have drafted over the last half decade. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed. With the exception of Watson, never really the most exciting athletic freaks, for lack of a better term, find their way on the Packers roster. And in fact, that usually number one receivers or first round receivers don't find their way on the Packers roster. If I was to suggest Jaden Higgins out of Iowa State being a second round pick going to Green Bay, how likely do you think that pairing would be, Higgins to the Packers?
Well, he's another one of those type of guys, is he not?
That's what I'm saying. Like it's a leading question here, counselor. I apologize, or to my witness here. I'm trying to say, like, I think Higgins would make a lot of sense for Green Bay, and then I also think that if he did get there, I think it would be not only a Packers pick, but I think it's a Packers pick that pans off for fantasy players too.
Yeah, so the thing that really jumps out to me is this guy who has been able to thrive and draw targets at every depth, right? 44 underneath, 56 intermediate, 36 deep last year. Backs who were covering him were dinged for 9 defensive pass interference penalties. That's an additional 114 penalty yards. That was fourth most in the country. You have a player who, I mean, is like a rich man's Alan Lazard. Is that damning with like way too faint a praise? He's going to be a good player, but
okay, all right. Well, and I could be wrong on him. Maybe I built him up into something that he's not. But yeah, rich man's
he's going to be good.
Lazard. Okay. Well, rich man's Alan Lazard is like, is this getting?
I like
back
Alan
at me?
Lazard coming in, and now it's like just me and Aaron Rodgers, but I don't draft him like Aaron Rodgers.
Right.
Takes him around.
Let's do this. Cullen Hoffman wants to bring up, and I know we got a bunch of other receivers we're just not gonna have the time for, but Cullen Hoffman wants to know your thoughts on some late round rookie flyers that he likes, and he mentions Ty Felton, and he also mentions the speedster Arian Smith. Your thoughts on those two guys, or maybe some other late round flyers that could make some sense for dynasty rookie drafts?
Felton, I think, is pretty exciting. We have a grade on him that I think is above where the community is. You talk about the dynamism in terms of likely athleticism, and then some of the things that he was able to do in that last year, he's somebody I think we're going to be looking at pretty closely and wanting to see a bunch of situational types of things, because I mentioned that I thought that this draft is somewhat thin at the top. And then, I mean, obviously there are interesting guys, but there aren't a ton of players deep where you're like, this guy is just wildly mispriced. He's going to be very, very good, almost guaranteed. I don't think that we have that, but Felton is somebody who in some ways might be the closest. Now, he's not as deep as you can get, but that's a name I'm not surprised he came up with, because I really do like that one.
About a month, and I want to switch to tight ends here. About a month after the draft this year, Tyler Warren is going to turn 23 years old. How concerned are you about the age factor for Warren? And I only bring up the age with him because I'm really picking at nits. I can't really find a lot that I don't like about him, but he is a little bit on the older side.
Yeah, the age is a problem, right? And yet I think you're looking for people, and you see that with Fannin as well, where like, okay, well, I don't buy it because of the level of competition. And then you're saying, but wait, right? Yeah. So you need to adjust for the age, or you need to adjust for the level of competition. But the stats that these players put up are so far off the charts. You're basically just talking about names like Kyle Pitts and Trey McBride and Brock Bowers as being remotely in the range of tight end seasons in college that you could even mention with them. Now, those guys were in different contexts and did different things well, but when you're an older prospect, you have to hit a much higher level of production to accomplish the same thing. When you're talking about production that then says, I'm going to be a star, I mean, it'd be very hard to argue with the idea that regardless of his age, that Warren hit that.
Okay, so I know that, and this is the last thing I'll bring up here. Harold Fannin Jr. is not going to catch 117 balls his rookie season in the NFL like he did at Bowling Green last year. But is he going to translate to being a reliable pass-catching tight end for some team? He's not the biggest guy in the world. I mean, I guess it kind of depends upon how he holds up in line once he gets to the next level. On a scale of 0, where you hate this guy, to 10, where you could not be more excited about him, what's your level of interest in Harold Fannin Jr. in the NFL?
I'm just going to go with 10. I haven't drafted him necessarily at that level because I think that this is a player and a profile where there are likely things that just, do make it a little bit faulty or a little bit fluky, and even elements like, what's, positional types of elements. But you're talking about a guy who evaded 29 tackles, 900 yards after the catch, 333 yards just after contact. When you think about how many elite tight end prospects don't have 333 yards for their final season, 6 drops on 155 targets. He drew 30 deep targets. He gained 565 yards on balls that traveled 15 yards in the air. I mean, all the numbers are silly, right? And the tracked athleticism at the Senior Bowl was very good. That alleviates some of the concern. I think that if you don't have true tight end size, you do need to be a freak athlete to, really translate and convince a team to make you a big part of their offense. I mean, you have Mike Gesicki out there as one of the all-time great athletes, and teams are just like, we don't have any use for you, right? Every blue moon you catch 9 balls and then you don't play for 6 weeks. That doesn't work for fantasy. Are we going to have that? I love to root for these guys who go out and do on the field everything you can possibly do. And certainly Warren and Fannin did that beyond our wildest imaginations last season.
Tyler Warren and Harold Fannin played each other September 9th this past fall. Tyler Warren, 8 catches, 146 yards. Fannin, 11 for 137 and a touchdown against that vaunted Penn State defense. There's something there. And to read more about Fannin, Warren, and all the other players we talked about tonight, go to rotoviz.com and get the rookie draft guide now with 80-plus player profiles written by Shawn Siegele at FF_contrarian on the X, the scribe for RotoViz, who was fantastic tonight and helped change a lot of opinions on some of my players. Well, not change them. Maybe you changed them on McMillan, but definitely modified them on some other players as well. The podcast is RotoViz Overtime with you and Colin Kelly. It seems like that's like once or twice a week now.
We have lots of episodes, usually 3 times a week. We'll see.
3 times a week. Okay. All right. And then, of course, Stealing Bananas with Ben Gretsch is always a must listen for me as well. Shawn, we'll have to do this again sometime. Thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
It was awesome. Thanks for having me.
MyFFPC.com is where to go for the big gorilla, the Dynasty Orphan Squads, and the FFPC Never Too Early Superflex and Best Ball tournaments. Check us out next week. We'll be back at 7 o'clock next Thursday with plenty of Combine news. He is Shawn Siegele for our producer, Matt Deutsch. I'm Eric Balkman. This has been the FFPC High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network.